Hey everybody, welcome to my tiny kitchen. This is Cooking 101. I'm Jen, I'm a registered dietitian. I am not a professional chef, but my job includes helping people decide how to cook healthy meals. A lot of what I do is take foods that people really like to eat and try to show them how to create them in a healthier way that they can still enjoy what they like, but get benefit from it, feel better, improve their health, etc., etc. So I started Cooking 101 because everybody's stuck in their houses, everybody's cooking more, they don't know what to cook, and they want to be able to help themselves. Also, everybody is pretty stressed out, and if you're like me, when you're stressed, you eat. So today, based on a request I received, I'm going to show people how to make a very popular comfort food, ramen. But the twist is, which was the request, it's going to be vegan. I'm also going to show you how to ratio ramen out so that it's not quite so calorie dense. Ramen at its core is full of delicious noodles, which are really high in calories, and really salty broth, which is really tasty. But it can be a little much for people, especially if you have issues with high blood pressure or water retention, bloating. It's not for everybody. So I'm trying to kind of create this vegan recipe, because vegan was the request, that incorporates lots of healthy things, reduces the sodium a little bit. There's lots of challenges here. Also, I wanted to make sure that I honored some of the cooking traditions that go into Japanese ramen, because I think it's important to not completely change a culture's cooking, and then just claim it as your own. So I don't know a ton about Japanese cooking. I have made some basic dishes that I can apply cooking techniques to today. And then I also consulted on a blog of someone who does know things that I don't, which I highly recommend. If you don't know how to make something, go look it up. Go consult someone who knows a little bit more than you. For me, I looked at Caroline Nika Phelps's blog, which I believe is called Pickled Plum. Yes, it's Pickled Plum. She is Japanese French Canadian. She also traveled through Asia and spent quite a bit of time there, living there. So she picked up all of these traditional cooking techniques and is able to blog about it. And she had a very lovely blog on making ramen. And I got a lot of my notes from that. Because I don't actually make ramen on my own. This is a new adventure for me too. So you guys can come follow along with it. So at its core, ramen has a bunch of different components. The broth component traditionally is animal-based. So it's either chicken broth or pork. It's slow roasted, slow cooked, not roasted, but slow boiled. Over many hours to really impart impactful, deep flavor. There's a couple different types of broth, but it's usually chicken or pork. There's been a lot of interesting add-ons and experimentations in Japan. Seafood, lobster, shrimp, all go into stocks. Duck, I've seen duck ramen. My husband and I are actually going to travel to Japan, hopefully in September, like fingers crossed. And I've been checking off all these different places I want to try, like duck ramen. Give me one sec, because the cat is being an asshole. Ollie, stop it. Do something. Okay, I'm back. We have animals. They get into everything. My cat really likes to jump on the television, which is problematic. So, sorry about the interruption, guys. Okay, so, right now, where was I? Oh yeah, my husband and I were planning a trip to Japan, so I've been, mapping out where to get every type of ramen I can possibly try. I'm very excited about it. So, in that way, I've actually found out a lot about what's available. My broth is boiling over right now. But it's all basically animal based. There isn't really vegan options there. I've traveled through China and I found out a similar thing. They don't have, I'm sure now, because when I traveled through China, this was 15 years ago, good God. maybe 13. It's still a long time. They didn't even have a word for vegetarian, and they didn't understand what we were trying to communicate to them. One of my travel companions was a vegetarian, and they basically brought us vegetables covered in pork. So veganism isn't very traditional in Asian cooking, but things are changing right now, and we have the technology basically to create things like vegan ramen. So why not? We can even honor their cooking traditions while doing it. So back to the broth. Like I said, usually chicken or pork based with other fun things that get added in, but all animal stuff. When doing a vegan ramen, you need a broth. You can do it with water, but it's going to be really flavorless. So what I started with was vegetable broth. Vegetable broth, you can make it your own home. All you have to do is save any of the veggie scraps that you were chopping up, like the root part of onions or the tops of carrots. Any stuff that you don't use in your cooking, you can actually freeze in a bag, and then you just pop it in a pot and add water and let that simmer over an hour or two, and there's your vegetable stock. So very easy to make at home. I bought it because it's easy to buy it in a box for me right now. So I'm starting off with that. Now, vegetable broth on its own does not have the complexity that ramen has, ramen broth. So I'm getting some other things in here to kind of pep it up a little bit. So the first thing I did was I bought a bunch of dry mushrooms. Now, I happen to live near an Asian market. I am very lucky in that way. So, Alan, I can see you making comments, so thank you for that. So I live 2 blocks from an Asian market. I can access stuff that a lot of people can't access very easily. People who might be watching in New Jersey, there are some delightful Asian markets around there, but you have to kind of find them. The one we used to go to was on Route 22, if anybody lives near there. And I know that's a very long highway, but there's an Asian market. So go to your Asian market if you can. If you can't, do your best. Do what you can do. You can buy dried mushrooms at regular supermarkets. I've seen them. I actually have some. Earthy Delights is one version. At my Asian market, they actually have these huge packets of freeze-dried shiitake mushrooms. Very exciting on live television. And I just took advantage of that because you don't usually find packets this big of freeze-dried shiitake mushrooms, and that's very beneficial. So why dry mushrooms? You can use fresh mushrooms, but to make a broth, you're basically going to cook them to death. I love dried mushrooms for making broth because you can basically steep them like tea, and they'll come out really tasty with a tasty mushroom broth, and then you have the reconstituted dried mushrooms, which you can then add to your food, and so you get more bang for your buck when you use dried mushrooms for this kind of cooking. The second thing I used is a Asian market exclusive thing. You can get this at Whole Foods, I'm pretty sure. But it's called Kombu, and Kombu is basically kelp. In fact, I think it means kelp in Japanese. I'm studying Japanese. I didn't get to Kombu yet. You can find this all over Asian markets. They have like literally an entire aisle full of seaweed. You want to make sure it's kelp. There's a metric ton of different seaweeds out there for sale, especially in an Asian market. You want the kelp one to make broth. So there's a specific type of broth in Japanese cooking called dashi. And dashi is, it's not always vegan. They actually often add a second ingredient, which I also have because I make dashi a lot, bonito flakes, which is fish that's been dried out, usually tuna, and then they shave it into these fine flakes, and it's a really tasty topping if you're not a vegan. But it's not vegan, so we're not making our dashi with bonito today. Kombu dashi is really easy, like really, really easy. You can do it 2 different ways. One is you put it in a container, you fill it with cold water, it doesn't have to be freezing, and you drop a couple strips of the kombu in, and then you just leave it for several hours. and it infuses and it's great, and that's your kombu broth. I didn't have several hours today, so I did a heat method. You can heat it up in a pot of water and just make sure it doesn't come to a rapid boil. You want to like gentle heat simmer, not getting to a boiling point, and that'll impart the flavor. What I did was, because I was reconstituting the mushrooms, I also stuck the kombu in the same container. So I have a container full of kombu and mushrooms that's been steeping for about an hour. There it is. And that's my broth. Now, kombu on its own is a natural source of glutamic acid. What is that? That is the natural form of MSG. This is important because MSG is actually a really good flavor profile. It is a cornerstone of umami flavor. Umami is one of the tastes that your tongue can taste, including bitter and sour and sweet and salty. Umami is the newest one we've discovered. I think they've been kind of figuring out there's some other taste buds that are kind of coming out that are partial. It's complicated. But the umami flavor comes from things like mushrooms, which is why I'm making a broth with mushrooms. It comes from anything with glutamic acid, which includes the kombu. Tomatoes have it as well. And naturally it occurs in a lot of vegetables. You also get an umami flavor from meats. It's that kind of meaty, rich flavor. But you can make it in vegan cooking as well. And it really deepens the flavor profile, which is why I'm adding this stuff into my vegetable broth. That's going to kind of uplift the vegetable broth a bit so that it's not just a plain broth. It's got some dynamic flavor to it. So I steeped my mushrooms and my kombu. I'm going to strain it. Here's my strainer. And I'm going to add it to this vegetable broth that has been heating up on my stove. All right. The reason I'm straining it is I'm going to save the mushrooms and the kombu to add to the finished product. So basically, this becomes veggies that you can have. Now, kelp is not for everybody. It's usually that thick green vegetable at the bottom of your miso soup. And it has an interesting texture that not everybody likes. I like it, so it's going to go in mine. This is all optional. You don't have to add it. If you hate mushrooms, I encourage you to still make this mushroom broth, but you don't have to add the final reconstituted mushrooms to the meal if you don't want to. So that's the broth portion of ramen. If you want to just do veggie broth, that's totally fine. I'm just trying to draw a little bit on Japanese cooking here because dashi is pretty traditional, and also make it a very complex, rich broth. Just checking my heat. Okay, so this is just warming right now. Give it a little stir. All right, so that's the broth. That's how you make vegan broth for ramen. That's step 1. Step 2. Because this is not the only thing that flavors ramen. We're going to make something called a tare. Tare is, in Japanese cooking, a dipping sauce, but in the realm of ramen, it's also the big umami flavor bomb that goes in ramen. You'll make tare and then put it at the bottom of the bowl, and then you pour your broth on top of that. So I actually started mine, and I used Caroline's recipe. But before we get into how to make it, I want to just go over different types of tare, because there is several different types of ramen out there. There's Shio Ramen, which it literally means salt. Shio means salt. And Shio Ramen is not just, you're not just adding salt to it. There's some complexities that go in there. All of these are basically spice pastes or liquid sauces, dipping sauces that you make. So Shio is the first type of popular ramen. The next is shoyu. That's usually made with a soy sauce and a bunch of other stuff that goes in it. And then what I'm making today is miso ramen for a couple of reasons. One is the salt factor. Like I said, Asian cooking, especially soup bases, are so salty. They're not the healthiest thing. Even when you don't have health issues, a lot of salt in your diet can make you feel sick. I'm going back to the glutamic acid MSG talk I just made. MSG doesn't make people sick. There's no such thing as MSG allergy. That was a thing that was made up to shame Asian restaurants who were just cooking traditionally. Like I said, it appears naturally in foods like tomatoes and mushrooms and the kelp. If you're eating tomatoes and mushrooms, you're not allergic to it. So, but people do get a little bit weird feeling when they eat certain things with MSG in them. Sometimes they get weird feelings when they're eating things with glutamic acid in them. Why is that? Well, MSG is salty, and Asian food is salty. Much saltier than some of us are used to. Not all of us. A lot of us who eat out a lot are being exposed to a ton of salt all the time. So, most people are not feeling sick because they have an allergy to MSG, because that really isn't a thing. People who feel off might be feeling off because they just had a metric ton of salt. I cook with almost no salt in my food, so when I eat certain things that are high in glutamic acid, high in MSG, I start to feel really weird and off. And you might be reaching for a huge glass of water for that reason. You could get a headache because you're a little dehydrated. So that's entirely possible. I love Asian soup bases. They're so tasty, but they are like an entire day's worth of salt, which we've gone over this before, is like 2,000 milligrams. You can have that if you have a big pot of Asian soup with soup base. It's very easy to hit that with one meal. It's tasty, but it's too salty. So what we're doing for today is I skipped the Shio Ramen, and I skipped the Shoyu Ramen. You can get Shoyu, aka soy sauce, that's low in sodium, which I use, and it's very tasty. You get that nice fermented soy flavor without all that salt kicking into your diet. So I could have made that work, but I decided because I have a bunch of miso paste in my fridge, I'm going to do miso ramen today. So that's the third type, is miso ramen. If you've ever been to a restaurant and you've seen things like Tonkotsu Ramen, which is not the same as tonkatsu, Tonkotsu Ramen refers to the type of broth. Tonkatsu is usually a rich broth that they slow cook pork bones, but then they rapid boil it. So all the fat coming off those delicious pork bones is then getting emulsified into the broth, and it looks creamy as if they made a bisque almost. So that's what that is, but it doesn't really refer to the tare. The tares are salt, soy sauce, and miso. Those are the three big ones. So why miso? The first thing was the salt. There are a couple different types of miso. I'm using white miso. What does that mean? So there's two different types of miso. There's white and the red. White is low in sodium. Red is much higher in sodium, and it's a little chunky. They're both great. Red is far more fermented than white is, and it has such a deep umami flavor. I'm a big fan of this stuff, but it is much, much saltier. So to keep in our theme today, I'm using white miso in the tare. If you want to find miso, Whole Foods for sure has it. Outside of Whole Foods, you're going to have to look around. Asian market, look at your options. I live in a neighborhood where a couple of the grocery stores are kind of hopping on the Asian food bandwagon because the Asian market came in and they wanted to compete with them. So I can now get this all over my neighborhood. But you might have to look around and see what you're doing. And then I dropped a scallion on the floor. Yay! Okay. All right. So, we're doing the miso tare. I'm using white miso because it's lower in salt. Notes on miso. It is a fermented food. Fermented foods are awesome because they are full of probiotics. Miso is delicious and full of a lot of rich flavor. I am a huge fan of it, and you can eat it raw, and it also lasts forever because it's fermented, so nothing wants to live in here because the good bacteria moved in and they're not sharing with the bad bacteria. So if I dip my finger in, it's salty, it's umami, it's delicious. Sometimes when I'm really craving salt, I might have a little spoonful of that. And I can dip my finger in it because my husband's not going to go after it, so it's all mine. It is full of probiotics, so it's very good for your digestive system. If you want to get more probiotics in your system and you don't want to eat yogurt, which is especially good for vegans because it's hard to find probiotic-rich vegan yogurt, miso is an option. However, as it is with all probiotics, they are living organisms. When you dump this into soup, they die, so it's no longer probiotic. If you want to get benefit from it, like I said, you can eat it cold, raw, out of the thing. You don't have to eat a spoonful. Make a miso salad dressing. That gives you probiotics. Or a miso dipping sauce where you're not cooking it. Those are all good ways to use miso where you're getting all that beneficial bacteria in your gut. Why probiotics? If you have upset stomach or chronic irritation, it can soothe that. It can make things digest faster and more efficiently. Gut bacteria, they're studying more and more, and having a good balance can really improve your health overall and how you feel and how you digest things. So probiotics are great for that. Miso is a probiotic source. When you cook it, they all die. It's still tasty. You can still have it. It's just not going to give you all that probiotic help. All right, so that's my miso spiel. The other thing about miso is it is made from soybeans, but when you ferment soybeans, you get more benefit and a lot of the, I don't want to say negative because it's not negative, but a lot of the issues with soy that come up, like it's hard to absorb nutrients from fresh soy because they have a chemical in them that kind of blocks half of the stuff the good stuff you want to absorb into your gut. When you ferment it, that goes away. So you're getting all the benefits now and none of that compound that can block absorption. Fermented foods are awesome. Fermented soy is healthier than fresh soy, and I highly recommend it in all its forms. We talked about tempeh a couple weeks ago, and that's another fermented soy product. And it's awesome, so I recommend it. So, I started making my tade before I logged on because I didn't want you guys to watch me mix things forever. So it's mostly made. I did not add the last ingredient, which is ginger. But what went into this was a 1/4 cup of miso. And then I added, so the recipe called for 2 tablespoons of cooking sake. I do not have cooking sake, and I did not know where to find it. And it's been my experience that cooking wines, at least in America, are full of salt. I had this sake, which my mom brought because she loves sake and I don't. It has been sitting here, so I was going to put it to good use and put it in my mix. So there's some good old-fashioned, high-quality alcohol in here. The recipe calls for 2 tablespoons. This is not cooking sake, and I did not want to knock myself on the floor, so I put 1.5 tablespoons in. It also calls for 2 tablespoons of mirin. So Kikkoman is one of those brands that you see everywhere. It's a very Americanized Asian brand. I get the impression over the years that it's not the best quality of this stuff, but this mirin you can find in most grocery stores. That's why I have it. It's easy to find. And it's just basically a sweet rice. It's kind of cooking wine, but not. It's a seasoning, and it's in a lot of Asian cooking. So I just kind of have it on hand. If I have a recipe that calls for it, then it's good to go. I also added a little over, it calls for 1/2 teaspoon of sesame oil. I added a little more than that because I love sesame oil. It's delicious, and I skimped a little on the sake so I didn't knock myself on the floor. So that's another flavoring agent that I added in here. And then the last thing you're going to add is some fresh ginger. I don't recommend powdered ginger. When you dry out ginger and it sits around for a while, it gets very spicy, but there's not much flavor left in it. I freeze my ginger, so this is like soaking wet right now because it's thawing out. To add it into this, I'm going to grate it. Now, this is called a microplaner. I've used it before. It's awesome. Everyone should have one of these. This is how you make lots of finely grated zest off a lemon. You just put the lemon against it and the zest falls right off. If you are a cheese eater, this is how you make very fine Parmesan snow, by grating it. I'm going to grate the ginger into the tare now with it. Alright, this is adding a little bit of water from the ginger, which is not the end of the world, because it's ginger flavored water, basically. But that's what happens when you freeze it. I freeze all my ginger. I've been told by a professional chef that's a terrible thing to do. Don't do it. Well, I don't use a lot of ginger, and I hate wasting things. And I'm not going to sit there and come up with 6 recipes that need a giant hunk of ginger in them. So I freeze it, and I use it over time, and it's usually okay. I do recommend if you freeze it, you might want to grate it while it's still frozen, which is totally doable and an easy thing to do. It will probably grate a lot more easily than this is right now. But we're making progress. Alright. Get that ginger flavor in there. We're making progress here. Slowly but steadily. Also of note, I peeled this ginger. Again, a professional chef told me, always peel your ginger. Over the years, I haven't. Nothing bad has ever happened. It doesn't change the flavor. Alright, so ginger has gone into the tare. The recipe calls for about a teaspoon, so not a huge amount. Then I'm going to just stir that together. And that's it. So I've got my broth. It's warm. It's mixed with delicious umami flavors in the mushroom and the kelp dashi that I added. And then I made the tare, which is the flavor bomb sauce. I'm going to call it that. Seems like a good name. And third component, noodles. I cooked my noodles already. You don't have to watch me do it. So ramen noodles. There are thick ones, there are thin ones, there are curly ones, there are straight ones. You can kind of use the noodles that work best for you. I went and got curly ones, chuka soba. They're wheat-based. Again, this is another really commercial Asian brand, Kame. I get the impression not the best quality, but there was nothing wrong with those. There are 3 ingredients. That's really what I care about. Flour, salt, and water made those noodles. And that's what all noodles should have. It shouldn't have anything else added to it unless you're getting crazy with, like, green tea noodles. But these were perfectly fine. Again, you can probably find these a lot more easily than the stuff that's sold in an Asian market. If you want to do fresh noodles, that's also a thing. It's really personal preference. The dry ones cook incredibly fast. It took 3 minutes. And then once you cook them up, you run them under cold water so they don't overcook. Because when you remove, I found this a lot with Asian noodles, but when you remove it from the heat, they'll still keep cooking because they're still really, really warm. So the noodles are all cooked. And then the fourth component that you would add to ramen is the toppings. So that brings me to ratios of noodles to toppings. Now ramen, the showcase stars are the broth for sure, and then the noodles. However, that's a lot of calories to have a huge bowl of noodle soup. So if you are being health conscious and making your comfort food ramen, what I would suggest, and we have talked about this before, is reducing the portion of noodles to everything else. Vegetables should always be the biggest part of your meal. That's because veggies have lots of fiber and they're slowly digested and they'll keep you full. And they are not full of rapidly digested calories that will be burnt up and you'll be hungry again. When you eat your veggies first, you're going to be full on that, and then you're not going to overeat the carbs so much. And again, I'm not anti-carb here. I just know that carb foods are full of calories. They have a lot of bang for their buck. They're very energy efficient in that way. So when you're assembling your bowl, I would say no more than a third of that bowl should be noodle. Now, if your bowl is like this big, a third of that bowl is too many noodles. So be accountable for how big your food bowl is. I'm going to grab one and I'm going to start assembling this for you guys. Let's see if I can get this bowl without knocking my light over. Close quarters. Also don't want to drop a bunch of my brand new bowls on the floor. All right, here's my bowl. It's pretty big. It's pretty deep. I'm not going to fill this up with noodles. I want the noodles to be the smallest component here. So the way you start is take your tare, put it a little bit in the bottom, depending on how much flavor you want. I put kind of a bit. There's a lot in there. I like it that way. Lots of flavor. So start with that. Next thing we do, well, we're going to put the noodles on. We're going to start there. So I'm going to place some noodles in, and hopefully they're not all going to stick together. Please don't stick together. Oh, they're going to stick together. All right, we're going to battle this for a sec. All right, that's still a lot of noodles, so I'm going to try and break them up a little bit more. If you have too many noodles, put them in the fridge. They'll keep. As long as you don't add them to the broth first, they'll keep overnight. So that's a pretty, I'm eyeballing this, so that's a pretty good amount right there. Okay. So I filled it up about that much with the noodles. That's roughly a third. Now, we've talked about this before, and I've said make your carbs a quarter of the meal. I'm being a little generous with the noodles just because it's ramen. It's not a veggie soup. You want your noodles in there. All right, so I've added my noodles. Now I'm going to add this lovely broth that I heated up for this occasion. It doesn't matter how much broth you add. Oh, one other fact. I use low sodium broth because we're making a low sodium soup. But broth is as much as you want. When you order ramen in Japan, you get the option of extra noodles and extra broth, to the two main stars. So it's really a subjective thing. I've got quite a bit of broth. Broth is also going to impart lots of nutrients in it because it is a veggie broth and it has all of the vitamins that all the vegetables that were cooked in it. So, the veggie component, which has got to be the biggest part, right? Because we're making healthy vegan broth. I have some baby bok choy here. And you can saute bok choy. You don't have to. I'm actually going to put it in raw because it'll cook a little in this warm broth. I've had it going over the burner this whole time. And I'm actually going to take out the really tender middle right here because I like all these little leaves. So I'm going to lay that in there. And some of the bigger leaves, I'm going to just chop in half. All parts are good. This all works as dark leafy greens, which are really high in nutrients and are just very, very good for you. So we're going to make this a big part of the ramen. Alright. And you can buy bok choy as these single ones. This is the only one I bought today to just add to it so that I'm not inundated with too many greens. So we've added our bok choy. I happen to have some other fresh greens from my CSA. They're not really Asian, but they are vegetables. And you can kind of add any vegetable you have in the house. This is what I have. I've got lots of greens. And this is a good soup for greens because they'll wilt a little bit in here. They make it visually appealing with the color. Okay. So the next thing I'm adding, this has a little protein in it, is bean sprouts. Bean sprouts are back on track and being more in the Asian oeuvre. So I'm adding a little of that. And it breaks up the color a little bit, looks nice. You can also add herbs, any type of herb you like, but this is breaking with the Japanese part, but Thai basil is awesome in soups like this. And the recipe on Caroline's food blog called for Napa cabbage, which is big in Asian cooking, and also carrots. She sauteed her carrots and cabbage with a little garlic in some sesame oil, so that's an option for you as well. Alright, so we got our bean sprouts. I am going to add, well, that was a big no-no. Don't stick your chopsticks up in the air. That's not how you should leave your chopsticks. I just did that. That's a big faux pas for Japanese cooking. That means that that's for the dead, but I don't want to share my noodles right now. Okay, so I'm going to add, I've still got these mushrooms and kombu. I'm going to add a few shiitake mushrooms into the soup. This will actually add quite a bit of protein as well, which will keep you full. As well as imparting a little bit more of that umami flavor. You can also add some kombu. I'm going to actually save it for later because we've got a lot of greens going on at the moment. So just a few sections. Usually there's some meat in here, so taking the place of that pork that's usually set in ramen or fish cake are the mushrooms today. Alright, so I've added my shiitake mushrooms. And then I'm just going to finish everything off with a little bit of fresh scallion, which will look pretty and also taste awesome if I can find my paring knife. There it is. Okay. I'm very reckless with my paring knife. I like to just cut it using my thumb. If you feel comfortable doing that, do it. Otherwise, just chop it on a chopping board. No judgments here. If you're a vegetarian who eats eggs, you can also add a hard-boiled egg. I would actually steam it. I don't know how to make tea eggs. If someone does, go make a tea egg and stick it in here. It's awesome. I steam my eggs, and if you steam them, you bring the water to a boil for steaming, about an inch in a pan, and then you add the egg. And 11 minutes will give you a solid yolk, but if you want more of a liquid yolk that's golden and runny to put in your ramen, you can do it for about 8 minutes. And it'll be perfect, and it'll be very easy to peel. Steaming eggs has been a revelation for me. It got rid of the problem of having difficulty peeling eggs. But they're not vegan, so I didn't include it in this recipe today. But here is my beautiful bowl of ramen. So that's my vegan ramen, guys. It incorporated as much of the traditional assembly as possible. It got rid of a lot of the salt problem, and it minimizes the noodles, which noodles are a big part of ramen. Just the dietitian in me was trying to make this something that can taste like a big treat and comfort food, but is also healthy for you. So that was the compromise, was less noodles, more veggies. But this incorporates as much of the traditional ramen assembly as possible and imparts as much flavor as possible in something that usually relies on animals to flavor it. But this should kind of boost the flavor. And when you get lots of tasty umami things together, like fermented soybeans and the dashi and mushrooms, it really does make a difference. You may find you don't even miss the meat. So that's my recipe for today. Thank you guys for tuning in. Anyone who's able to, if you want to donate to the cause, I'm taking donations on my Venmo, which is at JSRockRD. If you can't afford it, that's totally cool. This is being made for you. It's supposed to be an accessible show. Any donations I receive just pays for the groceries that I use to prep these things. I appreciate you guys tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. If you have any cooking tips you want to share with me because I missed it, please let me know. I'm always really happy to see that. And if you end up making this, please send me a photo. I've started having people do that, and it's awesome, and it makes me feel really good that I'm having a positive impact on people's lives. So thanks for being here with me. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and I'll see you next week.